Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I'm happy to talk to you about some of the influences on Charles Darwin that led him to be able to sort of distill all of these ideas into his famous book on the origin of species by natural selection. And it's kind of neat. It's kind of like Charles Darwin, of course, formulated the idea himself, but he pulled upon other influences such as fossil records and things like artificial selection, his knowledge of geology, all kinds of things. And so that's what this discussion is going to be all about. So let's just jump right in it and see what comes. So this is his famous book on the origin of species, and what's interesting is it was written in 1859, and the thing about that is, the writing back then in Great Britain, 1859, is sometimes a challenge to read, sort of like Shakespeare. But like Shakespeare, it reads beautifully, and if you have an opportunity to own this book or download it on iBook, I recommend reading it. Even if you read just a couple of chapters, it's fine. And I just pulled out this one little quote from the last chapter. It's actually the last sentence of the entire book on the origin of species by way of natural selection, and it sort of exemplifies what I'm talking about in terms of the poetry of Charles Darwin and his eloquent ability to write and communicate his ideas. Just wonderful, sort of poetry. From so simple a beginning, endless forms. He's talking about all the living things on the earth. From such a simple beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Charles Darwin. So, very powerful book. And the whole idea, can be summarized in his book. He basically made 2 points. And these 2 points are that all organisms today, everything we see today, including ourselves, although he didn't specifically in this book mention man, but it sort of implied, the two organisms, today's organisms are descended from a common ancestral species. So every life form today is related. This is his point, and that natural selection is the mechanism of populations changing over generation, and that is overproduction, variation in the population, competition for survival. Some organisms are surviving in the population, therefore they're going to have a reproductive advantage, and therefore they're going to leave more offspring, and therefore be more fit, and therefore the traits in the next generation will be adaptive. And so natural selection is the mechanism. And so, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is this. It's hard to go back in time and sort of understand controversy, but geez, like the origin of species basically was a challenge to the worldview of that had been accepted for centuries, and that Western culture resisted the idea of any change in life. And so Greek philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle, this is a statue of Aristotle, they were opposed to the concept of evolution. How could organisms change? It seems perplexing. And then not only do they not sort of buy into the fact that organisms are changed and that they're fixed, but not only are they fixed and incapable of changing, but they were fixed in terms of like a hierarchy. There's like a ladder. Aristotle proposed that organisms were on sort of this natural ladder that he called, that were each rung represented a certain organism, and there was a hierarchy. And guess what organism occupied the very top? Yes, you might have guessed it. Humans. And so below that would be mammals and birds and reptiles and fish and insects, etc. And so this particular viewpoint sort of is, needless to say, condescending to these organisms. These are wonderful organisms. And so Charles Darwin's approach to this was not a ladder of life, but more like a tree of life. That there wasn't just these fixed rungs where the fish is better than the plant, but rather every organism living today is the tip of the tree. In other words, as beautiful as it can get in the moment. and that we're all descendant from a common ancestor. Totally different viewpoint, and so it's a clash. And so not only was his book a clash to Western culture and our Greek heritage, but it was also a clash with religion. I mean, the Old Testament doesn't mince words when it comes to creation. I mean, the Old Testament basically talks about how God struck life and created man, and that created all living things in one fell swoop. And so that why would organisms evolve or change, or why would populations change? I don't want to say organisms evolve because they don't. Why would populations change if God created them? I mean, that sort of implies God didn't do a great job when he created living things. And so literally for centuries, humans are sort of going along. And then in the 1700s, I find this kind of interesting that some people were, when studying adaptations of organisms, these naturalists, like this is a marine iguana found on the Galapagos Islands, you could study it and go, well, look how its dark scales allow it to like warm up on the rock after it's been swimming because it's cold-blooded. Its claws are adapted for holding on to the rocks when it goes into the water to eat algae. Its blunted nose is an adaptation to scrape algae off the rock. And you're like, well, what are you studying here? Well, what you're studying is something called natural theology. In other words, you're trying to understand God's design, God's plan. And so to know more about nature would be to know more about God. And so there wasn't really a conflict. So science and theology were very close. So you gotta imagine this, like in Charles Darwin's time in Great Britain, the naturalists, the scientists of the day, were sort of free to study astronomy and they were free to study geology. But when it came to life, it was very clear God created all living things, and they were not capable of change. They were perfect beings. Yet Charles Darwin, this is one of his first influences, was influenced mightily by fossils. On his journey, his 5-year journey around the world on the Beagle, he was impressed by the organisms from the past that were mineralized in sedimentary rock, like these are trilobites. They no longer live. It seemed clear to Charles Darwin and to other scientists as well who proposed the idea of evolution that organisms of the past are different today, and today's organisms must have changed in order there would be no other explanation. Likewise, when you look at the strata, in other words, the layers of sedimentary rock that you see here, like for example in the Grand Canyon, the organisms on the bottom are the oldest, the ones on the top are the newer ones, and these layers of sediment have built up over millions of years, and it shows a succession of types. In other words, down here there's fish, and then there's reptiles, there's amphibians, reptiles, and then mammals, and then most of the top is humans. And so what's fascinating is it's clear that organisms have been changing in the past according to the fossil record. I want to show you a little clip. I found this on the web. It's from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and it's kind of cute. It shows this scientist talking about it's kind of humorous about how fossils are formed in different layers. Let me play it.
These are nice principles, but let me give you a demonstration of this. Okay. Imagine, if you will, that this is a deposit of sediments, and this little ant farm-like deposit is an ancient landscape. A landscape populated by prehistoric humans. And this guy's just going to hunt a rhino with a spear. You know what happens when that occurs? This guy dies. Okay? The rhino goes along for 10 more years, he dies. An elephant comes along. Another idiot decides to take on the mammoth with no tools in his hands. He's dead. Eventually the mammoth runs out of gas. He's dead too. Saber-toothed tiger comes in here, looks for nothing, no dead humans, no or carcasses. 15 years later, he buys the farm. Now, a volcano erupts, covers these deposits with ash.
So these are the sediments of rock over time. older
And another
being on the bottom.
civilization arises, a civilization populated by the people of the Hello Kitty tribe. They're
Hello
bopping
Kitty.
along and fighting. And they do the head bonking contest and double elimination. Their pet gorilla wanders by. Oh, what happened to Hello Kitty people? Oh, 10 years later, oh, I'm out of food. No more bananas. There you go. And they're succeeded by a population of robots. All over the space of another century or so. And then another volcano erupts, covering the place with black ash. All right. Now, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. We're archaeologists. We keep things simple. What we have here is the principle of superposition and the principle of association. The older deposits are lower in the sequence. The younger ones are higher up. The objects that were deposited at the same time are enclosed within the same sediment. Now, when I say at the same time, I don't mean at exactly the same time. Here's the little weasel words. When in geology, when we say deposited at the same time, meaning they're enclosed in the same sediments, that means they were deposited by the same geological event, the same depositional event. Some of those individuals could have died days, months, years, decades, even centuries apart. So at the same time is a very fungible concept.
So that's I find that to be kind of interesting. And then especially when you go back here and you look at this, I'll just pause it for a second, especially if you have floods that come into an area, or if a river is carving. If a river carves like through the Grand Canyon, you can sort of like cut through this, and then you can see the different strata or the sediments along the side. Like for example, let's go back over here to the class notes. So picture that aquarium that we were just looking at with all those different layers. And so then when you look at this, you can sort of see how all of those different colors can appear here. And so you can literally, that's why these canyons are quite impressive, because you can go back and sort of look at all these strata. Well, fossils are not only interesting, but just the nature of this canyon. You guys, this wasn't created in just a few years. This was not created in 100 years. This was not created in 1,000 years. This was millions of years. So geological events take a long time. And so that's the transition that I want to make right here. Charles Darwin was not only influenced by fossils, but he was heavily influenced by geology, especially the book written by Charles Lyell. It had a real profound influence on Charles Darwin. And just to summarize, and basically in the book, it said that the geological processes that we see today, like a volcano or a river forming or mountains upwelling, these have to be the same processes that were happening in the past. I mean, it's completely logical, don't you think? It's like the same geological events we see today must have been occurring in the past. And so the Earth is a dynamic, changing place, and it's very old. We now know today, Lyell didn't know this, he would have liked to have, we now know the Earth to be around 4.5 billion years old. And so, how do we know that? Well, we use our chemistry, our radioactive isotopes, to date the rocks. So, geological events occur very slowly, and they're continuous processes. They're not, the Earth is far older than what theologians implied in their biblical writings. And so Darwin was familiar. He was familiar with volcanic islands. He knew that those were recent. Volcanic islands that come up from lava, they're tops of volcanoes above the ocean. These are recent. These did not occur as the Earth was created. So mountains can form, mountains can go away. He was familiar with that. And so these slow, subtle processes, they persist for a long time, and then you can get islands to form. This is how the Hawaiian Islands are. They're volcanoes. This is how the Galapagos Islands are. So these slow processes result in substantial change. So Darwin is like, what does this have to do with anything? So Darwin's thinking, well, if the Earth can make slow, incremental changes, and we can see these profound developments, why can't populations slowly change and evolve? And so this is what he's thinking. But Charles Darwin, and this is another important point, Charles Darwin was not the first person to propose the idea of evolution. No, he proposed the mechanism of evolution, which is natural selection. But one of the very first scientists that proposed that evolution was taking place was actually a very famous French scientist by the name of Jean Lamarck. And Lamarck in 1809 curiously published a paper on the theory of evolution, but he was right about evolution, but he was wrong about how it occurred. I find that there's a bit of an irony here. When he published this book on evolution was the very year Charles Darwin was born. So Darwin wasn't the first, but he was influenced by the idea that people were having about populations changing. And where did Lamarck come up with this idea that organisms were changing? The fossil record. So he and Darwin both agree that the fossils are fairly clear evidence that organisms have been changing over time. So what's wrong with Lamarck? Why was Lamarck wrong? Well, well, what he was right about is that he had a great fossil collection, and he saw that current species today were sort of similar to ones in the past but different. And he saw a chronological, in other words, you could see this, the younger fossils leading sort of like little steps leading to modern day species. And so he felt clear about the idea of evolution, but the mechanism was incorrect. But I think this is a moment that I want to emphasize something that I think is really important in science. When a scientist gets something wrong, when a mistake is made, they're not to be vilified for it, but they're to when you make a mistake, what it does is it leads you in the right direction. So we talk about Lamarck, about his incorrect ideas about how evolution occurs, and we give him credit because now we know the correct way based on the incorrect way. If that makes sense. His mechanism of evolution was that of use and disuse. He thought that when organisms used a structure or a trait, more often it would build up, and if you didn't use something, it would sort of diminish. So that whole phrase like use it or lose it was his sort of approach to this. And he also believed two things: that the traits that you acquire in your life, like for example, if you lift weights and you develop really strong muscles or really strong legs from running, those strong muscles would be inherited by your children, and they would be born stronger because of what you did in your life. But that isn't the way it works. That's not the way heredity works. He didn't know anything about DNA. DNA doesn't work that way in terms of passing traits on. It's like if you have something, your children will inherit it. So in other words, I can learn French, and my children are not going to be born knowing it. So, but he thought this. It seems kind of reasonable. Let me sort of get into Lamarck's head. He thought that body parts that were used extensively to sort of cope with the environment, like work it, would become stronger. Like deer that run away from predators would get faster and faster, and that traits that weren't being used sort of deteriorated, or like in other words, shrank. And so modifications during a person's life could then be passed on. He didn't really understand heredity, obviously. And so in his book, a classic example that he gave is in that he discovered in the fossil record evidence of giraffes with short neck, like bones that were kind of short. And so he thought, maybe what happened was the reason that the giraffe has a long neck today is that over, centuries, it's searching for food, stretching its neck, acquired a long neck, and then that from all that use, it just got longer and longer because it needed it. It was like a need-based idea of change. The more you need something, it was based upon want, and then the acquired characteristic of a long neck was then inherited. But it's not the way that happens. I mean, he thought that these original short-necked giraffes just simply kept stretching their necks, and they acquired a longer neck that was driven by inner need, and then acquired characteristics are inherited. Now, I know this sounds ridiculous today. I'm sure you're thinking, who believes this? But I tell you, people might still believe the fact that if you might be able to convince someone that your pinky finger is getting smaller because you don't use it as much, and so it's been getting smaller generation after generation. But that isn't the way it works. What you could set up a weight system and like lift weights and do like pinky curls and develop a really strong pinky, and your children will be born with the same size pinky as you. And so Lamarck's theory was visionary, of course. He believed in evolutionary change, and he was right about that. He looked at the fossils and he studied them. We still have his collection in museums in Paris. But his mechanism of how organisms changed, in other words, how they acquired characteristics and those characteristics were inherited and it was need-based, is incorrect. And so we can show this. I mentioned this example, like bigger biceps. In other words, lifting weights doesn't mean that your children are going to be born strong. It doesn't work that way. And there's no evidence of this. And so another example, I always like to throw in a redwood tree here. So you can take seeds from a really tall redwood and you can plant it right here and it'll be just as tall as the parent. But you can take the same seeds and put it in really poor soil and it won't grow very tall. And so it's not about what you acquire in your life. It's like you could be influenced by, for example, like poor soil. And so that isn't the way heredity works. And just another huge factor that influenced Charles Darwin, I mentioned this in a previous video, but it's worth mentioning again, is that he was influenced by the writings of a gentleman by the name of Thomas Malthus back in England, who noted in his famous essay that England was getting very overcrowded, it was getting overpopulated, there was a lot of homeless. And so he wrote this controversial essay about how humans are going to be competing someday in the future over resources. There was going to be a struggle to survive and that humans may not be able to keep up with the food supply. And so it just crystallized in Charles Darwin's head. He's like, yeah, that's it. It's not just humans competing over resources and finding a place to live. All organisms compete because all organisms overpopulate. Yes, that's it. And because there's variation, some do better than others. And those are the ones that survive and have more offspring, and that's what we mean by fitness. And so finally, he was also heavily influenced by artificial selection. He knew that breeders in England were capable of making all kinds of different breeds of dogs. If you want a short dog, you just breed the short dogs and you keep breeding them and breeding them. And so he knew that if you selectively chose certain traits based on what you want, not necessarily what nature wants, you can get any trait you want by breeding. And so he thought he would use in his book the idea of natural selection because people were familiar with artificial selection. And so I want to conclude this conversation about the events that influenced Charles Darwin by concluding with another video that I think is really cool on just the whole notion of dog breeding. I think it's kind of a cool video. I hope you enjoy it.
Dogs vary in all sorts of interesting traits, colors, hair textures, sizes, behaviors that are interesting and useful to humans. DNA studies suggest that all those different modern dog breeds are derived from wolves. Wolves have lived near humans for thousands of years, and the earliest archaeological evidence of domesticated forms of wolves or dogs is found about 10,000 years ago in human settlements. At that time, the skeletons of domesticated dogs looked fairly uniform and similar to wolves. By the time of the Egyptians, you can see these specialized breeds being developed that have long limbs and long muzzles. That breed actually still lives today in an ancient breed called the Saluki. Other breeds have been developed for hunting, retrieving, herding animals. Pointers and retrievers and sheepdogs are great examples of taking ancestral tracking and hunting behaviors that were present in wolves and turning them in to selected behaviors that are useful for humans.
So we've done this.
So how is it possible to take an ancestral animal and turn it into this broad diversity of different forms? Let's actually listen to a couple of human dog breeders describe how they look at an animal and how they decide what it is they want to do.
I think that his neck is a little bit too short. He's got great strength in the neck, but I'd like to have it just a smidgen longer. I also would like to have a little more muscle definition in the rear.
We really enjoy the ability to take the gene pool and use it like paints. It's our art. This is my art. I made this beautiful dog that I enjoy. I made her. I chose her sire and her dam. I chose several generations to make this beautiful dog. I'm very proud of her.
So that's interesting, and I might add, slightly creepy. But the point is, when she says that she wants the neck to be a little longer or a little shorter or whatever, you can't do anything with this organism. In other words, you can't influence this organism. If you want a shorter neck, you would want to take this dog and breed it. In other words, reproduce it with one that has a more profound, shorter neck. Now, that doesn't always necessarily mean that the children are going to be born with a shorter neck. It takes a lot of trial and error, because you know how the probability is in inheritance. But you basically, the breeder is acting like nature. Like, I want you to breed with this in order, and then when you get a longer neck, you allow the longer neck ones to reproduce, and anyone with a short neck you do not allow to reproduce. So you're basically choosing what traits that you think are successful. But nature doesn't work that way. It's like if this was a giraffe, like if there's short giraffe necks and long neck giraffes and a group of 100 giraffes, and the short ones can't reach the food, they're going to die. They don't have enough food to live. And so they're not going to have any children. And so the long neck ones actually get all the food, and so they're the ones that are living and reproducing. And so in the next generation, instead of it being half short, half long, if only the long neck ones are reproducing, the next generation there's probably going to be a lot of long neck giraffes. And so that's the change we're talking about. Individual giraffes don't change. It's the population, the number of long necks, and the next generation is evolving. So I hope you enjoyed that. Charles Darwin, so incredible, giving us the theory of natural selection, one of the greatest things in biology that we have going, but yet he was influenced by so many other people. It's a great story. I hope you enjoyed watching it. Thanks.